I'm very delighted we can have this conversation here today, because walking has always been, from the very beginning when I grew up in Switzerland, at the center of my interest. I kind of grew up in the eastern part of Switzerland, in the pre-Alps, not in the Alps, but in the pre-Alps, where of course Robert Walser went on his famous walks, and we installed a museum actually in honor of Robert Walser, a chronology museum, and of course the Swiss sociologist Lucius Burckhardt, our friend who so sadly passed away a few years ago. Lucius Burckhardt even founded a science called promenadology, which is a science of going on a walk. I think in English it's translated as strollology. And of course there could be no better interview than an interview with Hamish Fulton, who is the great master of walks. And I think so important are his walks, more important than ever before for the 21st century, because opposed to other walks, because of course many people have done walks in relation to art, his walks have never been leaving traces. There is an idea of no trace. That's, as the poet Ethel Ananshi always says, you know, it's very important, if you think about walking, is to leave no traces. So I'm going to celebrate today the works of Hamish and the idea of leaving no traces. But before talking about that, I wanted to begin with the very beginning and ask you how it all started, how art came to you, or how you came to art.
Thank you. So at the beginning I want to say thank you to Hans Ulrich also for this possibility. So this is also a privilege for me to have an interview with a discussion with Hans Ulrich. So the beginning, there is no one answer for my beginning. It's not like a simple, straightforward one answer, one date. It's a spread over many years. So the beginning of the thinking, because you have thinking about life and what you want to be and make, and then you have an occasion on a date when you made something. So the thinking started when I was about 13 years of age, and I read a book about an American Indian. Of course that's the wrong term, Indian. Indigenous person is getting closer, and his name was Wooden Leg, and he was a Northern Cheyenne, and in Cheyenne language his name was Kumakudiokta, and his name was Wooden Leg because he walked so much, and they said that his legs must be made of wood. So this man had a certain way of life, and he was born in something like 1858, and so when he died, the transition was giant from hunter-gatherer to ranching, farming, imposition of Christianity. So he had to kind of live through a whole way of life where at one time originally there were 60 million bison, and then by 1890 or 1880 or so there were only 365, not 1,000 but just a few. So all of this kind of went into my mind, and then I would jump now to 1967 when I was a student at St. Martin's in London, and the head lecturer there, a man by the name of Peter Atkins, he suggested the idea of why not make art about something that you're interested in. And this sounds very simple, why not make art about something you're interested in? But really, in terms of art history, you have a huge, big fork in the road, because ordinarily the student is learning somewhat by copying the art of other artists, either their contemporaries or earlier artists that have inspired them. And when you're presented with a challenge, why not make art about something you're interested in, then you have to sort of stop and think again. And then I'll just end this question by saying that it was, I started going to art school just about 20 years after the end of the Second World War. So that the culture was evolving, and young people were experiencing an element of freedom. There was a breaking down of behavioral rules, and so people had a feeling of becoming free from the constraints of the parent generation, which had come through the tragedy of the Second World War.
Now, of course, it's a moment, I spoke to Philip Barlow about that, I spoke to Gilbert and George about that. It's a very special moment at St. Martin's, because there was a kind of a rebellion also against a certain formalist sculpture the Anthony Caros and Kings and that generation, so to somehow go against that. So I was kind of wondering who, at that time, were your inspirations? Who were your heroes or heroines? Because it's interesting, I read an older interview with you, and you actually said that a really key influence from those years as a student came from literature, because you went to this amazing beat poetry festival, which I think happened in the Royal Albert Hall, which included William Burroughs and Allen Ginsberg.
This is absolutely true. So as I don't sit here for half an hour thinking up some names, I'll answer the question. What you're mentioning is absolutely true, that as a student I went with other students, a group of us went to the Beat Poetry Festival in the Royal Albert Hall in London, and you can say that, as it were, the saying, I was converted overnight, because basically this giant performance, which was really important, where the poets read their own poetry, so they expressed themselves in a very strong way, especially, let's say, Allen Ginsberg. I remember Allen Ginsberg reading a poem, and one of the words was the word fuck, and he said it across 4 or 5 microphones, and then a man over to the side there stood up. He was very smartly dressed, 3-piece suit, and he said, "This is an outrage." When you're a student and you hear this, you think, right on. It's sort of, for a student, for a young person, this is very wonderful experience. But the idea of being converted overnight to words was that the resonation of the experience of hearing all these poets reading their own poetry, and they were the great poets of that day, highly influential. Then of course none of us could sleep, and we spent the rest of the night walking all around London, unable to sleep, because we're completely charged with all of this energy, because huge energy came out of the poetry into the students.
Yeah, I was always very fascinated by that festival, because also one actually can read that there were thousands of people. It was highly experimental, and yet it was like a pop concert. It was pop concert. I think is interesting. Exactly. What could that be for now? No?
Exactly. It was like a pop concert.
And then, of course, already at the very beginning of your practice, you started to connect to walking, and that is something which, after 73 became the ultimate focus of the work, but it already starts earlier. Can you tell us about that walking epiphany, how that began, and about the very first time walking appears in the work?
Yeah, thank you. So I made my first art walk, that's one word with 7 letters, in 1967 with a group of other students at St. Martin's. We walked from the art school, which was at 109 Charing Cross Road in the centre of London, lots of buses, lots of traffic, people on the pavement, and we decided to walk from this environment out to a green field in the countryside. So this is like point 1, and then it would take me another 6 years of making different kinds of walks, and sometimes they worked out and sometimes they weren't quite as good as I would have liked them to be, and so by the time 6 years had elapsed, and I made a walk from northeast Scotland down to southwest England. It's a journey, one walking journey of about a little over 1,000 miles, and so then this became really big in my mind. It was a huge experience when it really just came to me as a very black and white, clear idea. Only make art about the experience of individual walks, and so that's what I did. And although still today in 2017, 18, I have read where art historians have said that there are no artists who make art exclusively about the walking experience, and that's just a lack of research.
And of course the notion of walk also brings us to the Pilgrim. I received a letter once from Chris Marker, and he was talking about the artist being a pilgrim, and I was kind of interested in this notion of the pilgrim, because you did an early work already in 71 called The Pilgrim's Way.
So in contemporary art today we completely reject the whole idea. Understandably, we completely reject religion, but religion can be very big, and there are many different kinds of people and religions existing in the world. But in this case, this is known as a Christian pilgrimage going from one town to another town, and the last ending town is where I lived, so I was actually walking home. But the issue of pilgrimages is very sort of difficult, because the person hearing this is drawn into the religion itself rather than the walking. What I was attracted to was that this was, and what I was really attracted to was not the religion, but the fact that this was an old pathway existing for quite a long time, a long time. So this then became appealing even then in the age of the car, because it was the age of the car. So then I'm making a walk of 125 miles, not very far, but a big experience, walking on mud and a footpath and so on, in the age of the car. And so it had nothing really to do with Christianity. I think one important point I'd like to make here about religion, when we compare religion, or the major religion of Christianity, but where you have a large city, and in the large city you have a cathedral, or in a small town or village you have a church. When you go to read about what Vine Deloria Jr. From Lakota, from North Dakota in the United States, sadly he died a few years ago, but he pointed out that indigenous religion, or if you want, so the relationship between indigenous peoples and sacred land, then the sacred land is several thousands of years old, and something occurs to people. People feel things in certain sacred sites, and those sacred sites may be very inconvenient to arrive at, whereas the Christian religion, other very large religions, are placed in convenient places. So even though we have the pilgrimage, what you have here is a very big issue of the land, and then the dominance of the human. So this is sort of one of the histories of global warming.
And I was also curious in terms of your works, because you said that you were interviewed a few weeks ago in Norway, and somebody asked you what were the art references for your works, and that was kind of a complicated question. So I was thinking, rather than asking you that, to maybe go further back in history, because of course works have been around for a long time. I mean, they're very present in the Romantic poets. We already mentioned the pilgrimages also, but then of course you yourself often refer to your works actually being connected to very old song lines, right? Basically lines with indigenous culture. So I was kind of wondering if you could tell us a little bit about that, about very old influences, because also I'm very fascinated always by the Japanese marathon monks, right, who do these walks around Mount Yeji. And I was curious also if you could tell us about the influence from those monks.
Yeah.
What are these marathon monks?
Yeah.
Because I think it's urgent that we learn from these marathon monks.
Yeah. So again, it's Buddhism, so very big issue, Buddhism. So just as in Europe and not all of the United States, since that's officially a Christian nation, you have Buddhism, which is very big, and so Buddhism then becomes, because it's an ism, it also has huge problems. And for young Japanese people, then they have the issue of the burden of tradition. They don't want this kind of tradition to be imposed upon them. So, but I'm not Japanese and I'm not a Buddhist. I can be thinking about Buddhism and it can appeal to me, but I'm not a practitioner of Buddhism. So the Tendai Buddhist monks from Mount Hiei, which is northeast of Kyoto, they are apparently the world's greatest athletes, because they do, cut a long story short, in one of their sections of pilgrimages they do 2 double marathons. That's I think 84 kilometers every day for 100 consecutive days. Wow. So this, if you put aside Buddhism and the Tendai school of Buddhism, and you're just thinking about being able, considering doing 84 kilometers every day for 100 days in succession, which is what they do, and it's documented, so you don't have to believe me. we're into fake news, so got the facts wrong, so I think that this became really very impressive and amazing. So I've been around Mount Hiei just a mere 28 times, whereas a completed cycle for a Tendai Buddhist marathon monk is 1,000, which is the circumference of the Earth. So just as a European artist viewing this, it became very impressive, and I was very interested to go there and see. And I was helped by some Japanese people who helped me. I could draw the route of the map. On the map of the route of where they go, so I went on the exact route of the marathon monks, and you go through different places. I mean, you can find it on YouTube anyway.
And maybe to end as a last question in relation to this question of influence, and then we move on. You also said in a previous interview that the flow of influences should be from nature to you, not from you to nature. Can you explain that to us?
Yes, I'm a walking artist, not a land artist. I'm a walking artist, not a land artist.
That is a great definition. Now, in 1973, another epiphany happened, because you actually made the decision in 1973 to only make art resulting from the experience of individual works, and stop doing any other practice. Can you tell us about what prompted the decision? Do you remember the day?
Yes.
When that came to you?
Yeah.
I think it's always interesting when such epiphanies happen. I interviewed Benoit Mandelbrot, and he described the day when he discovered fractals, or Albert Hoffman told me, the late Albert Hoffman told me the day he discovered LSD. So, and I think in art it's also very interesting to know when such epiphanies happen, to kind of locate them.
Yeah, 16th of October 1973. So the issue was that it felt really like as a young person, 27 years of age, it felt like a really fantastic idea, and that's just what I wanted. I wanted the feeling, if I'm going to be an artist, I want to have a really fantastic idea, not quite a nice idea, but one that's really just going to blow my mind completely. And so, but then that's all very well. And then you come to the next stage of such a major decision. Actually, it's a commitment. The issue is that then immediately it means I cannot make a whole lot of other things that were previously available. So that's really what I didn't quite understand, that it sort of cut off a whole area of art making that is not accessible for me. So I'm not free to go into all kinds of art making. If it doesn't come from a walk, then I can't make it. And this is really quite controlling, so I had to develop ways of making art based completely 100% on walks. But as I say, art historians, they don't really follow that. They think that you can make anything, and there are artists that make walks and they make sculpture, and it all becomes the history becomes mixed up. So that's why I sort of always stress that I'm a walking artist and not a land artist, because I'm completely 100% committed to making walks. If I don't make a walk, I can't make any art.
And now you've done so many walks that it's, of course, and I promised Artissima that this will not be a marathon, because otherwise we'll be here tomorrow. So, and it would be a very big marathon if we would talk about all your walks. It would take at least 24 hours. So we can't, it's a conundrum, because I would love to ask you about every single of your walks, but as we can't, I was kind of wondering if you can maybe tell us about one or two of your favorite walks where you felt that they were particularly satisfactory or successful?
Well, you have the issue of how much money have you got available to make a walk. And so one issue is making a walk which requires very little money. So whilst I came from where I live in England by jet and so on, but you can also make a walk opening the door where you live and going out the door, and then the expense is the expense of what you might eat in the middle of the day or drink, so you don't dehydrate, so water. So I made 7 consecutive walks. This is based on the marathon monks, of a mere 71 kilometers a day for 7 days in succession. And even doing that, not forgetting that it only cost a few pounds, not euros, a few pounds, very little money at all. You know, maybe 1 week's worth of sandwiches and water and chocolate bars is the same as one restaurant, you know, equivalent meal cost. But this experience was really extremely fortunate, because what I learned was that if I'm worried, like I was worried about money, but if I have money worries and then I have to get up at 4 o'clock in the morning and start walking, then you know that on the third morning and the alarm bell goes, because you can't just happen to wake up at 4 o'clock after you've been walking like that. You actually have to be woken up because you're tired, and then if you have a psychological problem, let's say financial worries, then this starts to eat into your brain energy for your body. So I was extremely fortunate that I managed to clear away all of my kind of psychological problems, and I managed to complete this walk. And other times I have tried it. I tried once to do 7 times, the equivalent of 50 miles a day, and so I did 2, and then on the third one, I thought that the weather forecast was going to be very good. It was in June, the weather was sunny. Actually then, and I was wearing a t-shirt and shorts, and I think I don't know if I was just carrying a sandwich and water in a rucksack. And anyway, the temperature dropped right down. And then, because I'd been walking a lot, all my muscles froze. And actually, I came into a village where it was very chilly. It was in the month of June in England. And all my muscles froze, completely just gummed up, froze up. And I just sort of managed to walk, you know, hobble to a bench and sit on a bench. And then I had to struggle to get to a phone booth and phone for a taxi to get home. Because you know, my muscles had completely frozen up. They'd gone cold. So that walk, I sort of can see it in different times and view it as an extremely fortunate walk. Then another walk, to sort of speed up, I worked with a Hausler gallery from Munich and Zurich, and amazingly they were able to find a budget through their collectors so that I could have the correct quantity of money to go on an Mount Everest expedition. And so they organised this large amount of money to pay a mountaineering expedition company by the name of Adventure Consultants. And if anybody has ever read Into Thin Air, Adventure Consultants is one of the 2 companies. The other one is Mountain Madness, from the 1996 disaster on Everest. So this was really amazing, because I think you have the 2 issues. You have 1, the quantity of money, and then 2, are you going to get to the top? So by far the hardest for me personally is acquiring the money. Not going. The mountain is one thing, but the money is like impossible unless there's outside help. But certainly this walk going is called high altitude trekking. That's I think that's what Messner called it, high altitude trekking. It's not actually continuous mountaineering. But anyway, I was in a company in 2009, and in 2008 you had the economic crash, so that the quantity of clients coming into Everest Base Camp in 2009 was relatively low, because one of the criticisms, of course, is vast numbers of people, great long queues going up the Lhotse face, and so. And that year I was very fortunate in that the numbers were lower because of the economic crash, so the clients were fewer, because the clients all tend to be CEOs and brain surgeons and so. But we had to go through the Everest icefall 6 times. You go up and down 6 times through the Everest icefall, and this of course, every time you go through there, then there is potential danger, and so you can't do any of this unless you're helped by the Sherpas. And of course then you realize you have a huge impression about the abilities of other human beings, rather than sort of coming back to England and saying, oh yes, I summited Mount Everest, big deal. But the issue is really that you can't do it without the help of the Sherpas. And then in this moment you are experiencing really superhuman people with superhuman abilities guiding you through a very dangerous place, the Everest icefall, because and you can see the influences of Tibetan Buddhism on the Sherpas, because they're scattering sacred rice and difficult areas, and like that, and you go around, and then you have to wait. you can feel the tension of these giant blocks. You can have a block the size of this room, this space could just go, and people do die there, people are killed there when it just moves, and people are crushed. And the people that get crushed, of course, generally speaking, are the Sherpas who are doing all the labour, the hard work for the, Western client. Well, not always Western, but for the client. So I think that was a very amazing experience going through there. And then I'll finish by saying that visually, the greatest visual aspect of going on Everest was the view from the balcony, which is not at the summit, it's lower than the summit. And then you see the triangular shadow, the perfect triangle of Mount Everest projected onto the morning atmosphere, and it's, you can't believe it. When you reach the summit, then you can sort of really, because each little increase in altitude, then the mind is working not properly, it's working less and less, even with bottled oxygen. So when you stand on the top, then it's, you never forget it. But in terms of visual experiences, the triangle, which disappears after a few minutes, it's gone. It's a very powerful image.
I was curious, listening to your realized works. We know a lot about architects' unrealized projects because they always publish them, and we know fairly little about artists' unrealized projects. And another Torino link is, of course, that Alighiero Boetti, who was a friend of mine, was from Torino, originally, encouraged me to always ask artists about their unrealized projects, because he says, when we know about artists' dreams, we can then maybe help them or facilitate these dreams to become true. So this is not to put those unrealized projects in kind of a realm of utopia, no, very on the contrary. It's a talking about unrealized projects in order to make them happen. So this said, I was very curious if you can tell us maybe about one or two of your unrealized works which have been too long to be realized or too big to be realized, or following also what you've just told us about the important economic component of the works, maybe too expensive to be realized.
Yes, well, this is my, I heard the question, but my answer is that several times in the past I've been somewhere, maybe in a museum, talking to a curator, and the curator asked me the same question, or what is your next walk, where are you going next? I give the answer, and then 3 days later, I slip and twist my ankle. And so that happens once. Then another person asked me, the next time I have flu. So every time I give an answer, then there's a tragedy, an accident, an illness. So I'm superstitious in this way, that if I say something, it will never happen. I prefer things to happen than have this kind of problem that I generate myself, but it works.
That's an extraordinary answer. And has there ever been, was the most extraordinary answers ever to that question, has there ever been a walk you had to interrupt?
Oh yes, yeah.
Can you tell us about one example of an interrupted walk?
Yeah, I walked in the 90s from, in England I joined up several of these old walks, the Icknield Way, the Ridge Way, different walks that you can join up. And I was on that walk, and it was before the era of the mobile phone, and I phoned my wife, and I asked her how she was doing, and she said, you must come home immediately, because something happened in the Tony Blair government, and I had to sign some tax paper, otherwise we'd be penalised. So, it's like not a reason I would ever have imagined. So I had to go on the train all the way back home, sign a piece of paper for the accountant, and then a few days later go back and start and do the whole thing all over again, because it's I don't ever do that where I don't do walks in pieces, in bits. It's either the beginning to the end or nothing. So I don't want to do a bit and then go back. You've lost the continuity of the whole journey. So that was one that had to be stopped and then started again.
Amazing. And that of course leads to the next question, which is, you of course always have to decide where you start the walk, but do you always know at the beginning where the walk ends or not?
In most cases I do, yeah. In most cases because of the sort of total plan. I think in espionage it's called E&E, entrance and exit. Because sometimes when I finish the walk I like to get out very quickly. So I like to know where the end is, but I may not arrive at the end, but I like to know what the possibilities are for leaving, exiting. I made a walk with a friend in 1978 in India, in the Indian Himalaya, and we were on a very old trail, but the monsoon rivers had made the rivers full. The river water had risen, and the only bridge on the for this river crossing had been washed away, and you could see the two sides. You could see the two sides of the bridge like that, and a gap in the middle. And so then we looked around, and we saw some big boulders, which would be the original bridge before they built the wooden one. So I went across on the boulders, jumping across, then I came back, and the friend I was with here, he was sitting down with two Indian people making tea. So we had some tea, being English and Indian, as opposed to Mexican or South American. So then when we went back to the water, again the water had come up, and now some of the boulders were now below the level of the water. So they had disappeared and it was a boiling river. So we jumped across with our bags, and it was a miracle. And the Indian guy, he had no bag, and he was ahead. And my friend, he had a rucksack, and he slipped on one of the boulders because it was all wet. And the Indian man, with his one hand, held him above the not rapids but the boiling river. Held his whole body weight plus the rucksack on his back. So and he just held him and then pulled him up. So if he'd gone in, I mean, with a rucksack, he would have sunk. But so then when you go to you learn about crossing rivers. You cross a river with the belt undone, because it's a sure way of being brought down in the level of the water.
Now that sinking thing reminds me of a very scary experience I had in Iceland once, because we went on a tour of the highlands in Iceland with Olafur Eliasson, and we had a phone, a satellite phone, so should we get lost?
Yeah.
But I didn't really realize that it was a satellite phone. It was just the only phone which worked, so I kept calling my office, and so we ran soon out of battery, which means that we were then really disconnected from the road, and we ultimately got lost, and it was really scary, and quicksand, and anyway, we got out of it, and it was all very scary. So I was wondering, if you ever got lost, or if it does happen to you that you get lost on your walks.
Well, I can relate a story probably geographically very close to your one. Just a few years ago I made a walk in southern Iceland, and I walked from the road with my tent and food and everything. I walked in, and then I put my tent up. And I was in the tent, and then the weather deteriorated, and actually a blizzard arrived, and it went on and on and on for several days. And so I could use the tent as a base, but I had to go out and come back in again. And then the weather actually continued to deteriorate, and the problem was that the snow was wet and the wind was very strong, and so the tent was actually getting stretched, and I was worried that the seams, the sewing would split, and then the whole thing would start to blow away, and then I'd be in big trouble. I was supposed to be there for 2 weeks, but in fact, it was a struggle to stay there for 7 days and 7 nights. So I phoned home in England, and I phoned the gallery in Reykjavik, I8, and explained this, and then a strange series of phone calls occurred. Because, and I'll speed up and reduce the story, because what happened was that a police officer in Reykjavik phoned my family home in England and said, "Do you realise that that he's in a blizzard, and that the serious is very, very serious, and we're just warning you." And I thought, well, how did he get the phone number? It was done actually through a sort of tracking, electronic tracking system. I mean, nobody gave the police the phone number, but anyway, so I was perfectly okay to go out myself, but when I got back to the gallery in Reykjavik, they showed me the screen, and you could see the swirl of the bad weather right exactly where my tent was, and other people had been helicoptered out. That's what they were basically wondering, did I need to be helicoptered out? And actually, you know, Michael Hoffner's here, he does walks, he knows about tents and weather. So actually it was perfectly all right. It wasn't really as bad as it had been, you know, projected. It was not quite that bad, but for other people, then they saw it and they wondered if I was going to, you know, be completely covered in snow. But in the end, it was fine. It was just this issue of the phone call from a policeman who I'd never spoken to, phoning my own home phone number. I thought that's a sort of, you know, because then we come into espionage and surveillance and so on.
Yeah, but it also brings us to another question, you know, which is the question of the digital age. And of course, you know, in 1989, it's not only the year the Berlin Wall fell down, but it is also the year Tim Berners-Lee, you know, invented the World Wide Web. And you know, I spoke with him last month. He, of course, is very worried because net neutrality is being lost as we speak, you know, and he wants to fight that because he says this is for everyone. But 1989 is also the year when the GPS was invented. And so I'm very curious, you know, given the fact that a lot of what you do has to do with maps, with mapping also, to which extent the digital age altered or changed your practice of walking or not?
Yeah, thank you. A few years ago I went with a French mountain guide and he had a GPS and we were in the French Alps and the weather wasn't very good, and he said, oh, today it's so easy with the GPS, you know, for a guide, he said, you just walk along and follow the GPS route. But for myself, because, you know, he's a guide, it's his job, he needs to get the client back safely. For myself, I don't ever carry, I never would carry a GPS system, partly because I'm partly sort of stupid and partly because I'm old, so you combine the two together and you have a kind of rejection of technology, and this is an interesting subject. It's not completely to do with being stupid. I think there is an area now where people are concerned about the brain activity in with regard to technology, but that's another story. Yeah.
Now, one thing I thought would be interesting is to bring it back to the exhibition, because of course you use the medium of the exhibition a lot for your work, and there is an amazing exhibition here at the booth of House of Contemporary and Michael Rizzo as part of this section we discussed in the introduction, and basically I was curious how you basically use exhibitions, because there seems to be something that the work has become more bright and colorful and also larger in size over the last couple of years or decades, and I was just wondering what's for you the importance of, you know, bringing the works into the exhibition and how that translation occurs, because it's not the realm of documentation. You use it really as a medium for itself. So I think it would be great to kind of bring it back to that, to talk more, hear you talk about that. And also how it changed over the years.
Yeah, thank you. So at the beginning I was saying that I'm a walking artist and not a land artist, and this is very important. It's not that I'm totally neurotic about this subject. But, the issue has to do with weight, you know, physical weight, because if you say this person, you mention a name and you Google it, and this person is a sculptor, so you have the name sculptor, and when you have sculptor then you have weight, physical weight, material weight. So what will you make your art out of? And so this is really central consideration when you're making art about walking, and walking is an experience. And so what I say is that walking art is the bringing together of two completely separate disciplines. Walking on the one side, then you have a big gap, and then you have art making on the other side. So what are you going to, how are you going to consider the issue of weight, physical weight and scale? So weight and scale may have to do with being very impressive and the selling price is very high. So if you make something small and light, then the transport issue is completely different. The transport issue with heavy work, steel or rock, is that you need to spend more fuel to transport these elements, and so maybe the transportation is still not battery oriented, it's still fossil fuel. So if you're making art about walking, then there is this issue of hypocrisy, I'm a hypocrite. I'm a hypocrite to a certain kind of level, because when we would read The Sixth Extinction by whoever it is, Elizabeth Colbert, then she's describing how when we're just living our normal lives, struggling with economy, somewhere to live, friendships and so on, then this activity is what is contributing unintentionally, in some cases, to the deterioration of the environment. So what I make, to answer the question, is kind of, it errs somewhat in the direction of being physically light. So you have small pieces of wood, which are several of the artworks in the exhibition.
Like the small sculptures on the wall with text.
Yes. Yeah, I actually don't call them sculpture. I call them walk texts on painted wood. Oh. Yeah. Because when we say sculpture, so you have sculpture that's like this size, then the continuation of the spectrum, and you end up with a giant Richard Serra sculpture. I mean, nothing against Richard Serra. I wouldn't want to be thought of an artist who is critical of other brother and sister artists, but there is a difference in weight, and the weight, it has to be moved from somehow, and then that's fossil fuel. So in this exhibition here, the largest frame is only about this big, so there's not a lot of there's not a big issue of transportation. The woodwork is minimal, and then the work on the wall, I prefer, it's a bit like being pedantic and saying it's not sculpture, it's a walk text on painted wood. I also like to give the thickness of the artwork as well, because so you have, say it's 4 by 9 meters, and then ordinarily art history doesn't feel very interesting to include the thickness. So because the thickness is what the work intrudes, that's how far it intrudes into the space, 1.5 millimeters into the room. So that in consideration of your question, then the scale can be big, but the thickness is only 1.5 millimeters.
Then of course there are the works on the wall, and so how do you call them? I mean, they're somehow wall drawings or wall paintings. How do you call them?
I guess it's a wall text in a way, but because partly there is vinyl in here, so sometimes I make works which are 100% paint, so then it's a wall painting.
And you use typography, different typography. There is sometimes sans serif typeface, there is italic, typeface, and then also more recently there are figurative elements. Can you tell us a little bit about these different aspects? The typeface, the figurative aspects of the drawings?
I think one way of thinking about graphic design, let's say today on a screen, is that you're moving elements about on a screen. So you're not actually involving trucks and moving artworks. So this is kind of one way of kind of thinking about graphics, that it could all be entirely on screen, online.
Now to come back to the walks, another very important thing happened in the 90s. I think it was around 1994 that you started to experiment with group walks, because obviously the walks we've discussed before are walks on your own, and that's also very interesting, because I think is very unusual, at least was very unusual at the time when you started. It was considered strange to go alone on a walk, so that's a very important aspect. But then in '94 you started to actually do group walks, and that has something to do with an experience we actually had together with the CCA in Kyushu, our friends Akiko Miyake and Nobuo Nakamura, who founded this extraordinary art center in Japan, and they took us around. We were together with Marina and you and Lawrence Wiener and Daniel Buren and Klaus Wiesenbach and a whole group of friends on a sort of a roadshow in many cities in Japan, talking about art. But you, of course, also used it to then do work in Japan. You actually started these these group walks, and they have become much more important ever since. And I mean, one happened yesterday here in Torino, so I think it would be great to hear a little bit more what prompted in '94 your epiphany to do group walks, and to which extent that is different, you know, from the solo walks.
Yes, just on the issue of solo walks, and I think solo walks are very good. They're very good for mental health. So I sort of recommend them. But immediately you come to the gender issue, and I have spoken with various women artists about their concern for making solo walks. But then the other year I met Catherine Destebel, a French alpinist, and she's one of the answers to this sort of gender question. If you have a look into what Catherine Destebel has done, then she's extremely impressive. But not everybody has to be like that. But I'm just mentioning that the solo walk has a gender issue to it. So in 1967 I made the first walk. I described students walking from central London to the field. Then in 1994, as you were saying, made a group walk with about 15 students, and this walk was really amazing because at the beginning, the student, I should say that what we were doing was we were walking from sea level more or less up to I think 622 meters, the top of the hill, and back down once a day. And it turned out that it was the hottest summer in Japan since 1945. So people were in the International University building, all in t-shirts, shorts, hats, sunglasses, sun cream, and by the time you come out to this air-conditioned space and you walked 100 meters, everybody's completely dripping in perspiration. And then the males would be drinking beer the night before, and so then there were contests to see how much perspiration developed on the midriff of the male. Anyway, we went up and down once, twice, and still people were sort of, it was 100% Japanese participants. They were concerned that it wasn't very interesting, they were bored, it wasn't going anywhere. So I thought, well, Japanese style, I'll double, so we got them down twice a day instead of stopping, go twice. And gradually there was a very interesting transformation in people. And certainly by the end, the group was a real group of people knowing each other very well in a short period of time, and nobody pulled out. Everybody, being Japanese, they were committed, and even though they were sort of suffering in some ways, in the evening we would have amazing good dinners. At the end, you'd go in the dark at night into a cafe in Yahata, and then the owner would close the door and nobody else came in, and the whole group was we were the only people in the restaurant eating, and then you'd hear all the stories about them drying their socks. I have so many socks to dry, I hope they're dry when I get back. And so it was very involving, and for me a wonderful experience, so that then it sort of transformed, by you were mentioning solo, to this. Then I had to start learning and having different ideas about other people walking as well. So one of my statements is the walking participant is also the art observer. So that, like yesterday on the Lingotto on the top there, that part of the idea is that it's communal, so people are walking together. It's not a solo, and there's no leader, and everybody is essential. There's nobody more important and someone's less important. Everybody's of equal importance. And you walk in a certain arena, which is the car track. So crossing the car track, which of course being English, it's the irony issue. The cars used to race around going round the way, and now we're walking fairly slowly backwards and forwards across the width, but with an amazing view yesterday afternoon of the Alps. So you have a combination of, you look and you see other people walking, and then you look to the distance and you see the sun on the pink glow on the Alps, and then you look and you see people that look quite bored. And people are sort of looking, why am I doing this, or what's it for, I don't... and then at the end, where you can talk with people, and you realise that you've read their faces not in the right way at all, and that actually some people are very, well, generally speaking, people are very enthusiastic at the end when I able to have a word speaking with them. You get very interesting, a direct, immediate response, not calculated academic intellectual response 1 week later. This is sort of just like 1 minute later, when people say very interesting things, like it went very quickly, because at the beginning you think, oh no, this is far too long to walk for 1 hour.
This, of course, is the most recent walk, yesterday, and for those of you who were part of the walk, it's of course wonderful to hear now the explanation of the walk, and for those of you who weren't there, it's wonderful to hear about what happened. I was wondering what else you're working on at the moment. I know that you can't tell us about the next walk, but what else are you working on? I'm also very curious what you are reading currently, and what you're inspired by.
Yes, good, thank you. So my working practice is to get up fairly early and read and write, and I read because I want to read things that are going to affect my mind in the thinking of my practice and my philosophy. Because.
And when do you get up? What time?
Between 5:30 and 6:30 or something like that. When the world is quiet and there are not many lights and there's not much movement and everything is quiet, so I'm able to really, as soon as I start reading, I'm absorbed right into the story immediately. And so the reading then reinforces and helps me in my thinking with regard to the environment, or nature, I should say, excuse me. The environment is a very vague term, it doesn't really mean anything anymore. The kind of things that I read are, generally speaking, sort of going from influence from Norway to the United States, even though the United States, according to Chomsky, is the world's largest terrorist organization. But these writers from the United States and North America, I should say, and Canada, have done a huge amount of thinking about nature and the land, because of the issue of the loss of land in these two countries. Whereas in Europe and England, every piece of ground has been dug over, moved, changed. So the kind of reading that I've been going in for is, like, say, Aldo Leopold from the United States in 1949 published a book called Sand County Almanac, and he said, we abuse nature because we consider land as a commodity belonging to us. So I think that for me this is like very profound in relation to being a walking artist and not a land artist.
You mentioned Elizabeth Colbert. We can no longer talk about climate change. It's really extinction. We're in the middle of a mass extinction in the world, and I think these authors, particularly Arne Næss, are at the forefront, and they've said that for many, many decades.
Yes. Coming from England, we haven't had an equivalent of Arne Næss. Because in England, in these terms, it seems arrogant to me to speak like this, but it kind of can be reduced to a garden. It's a garden, because you have hunter-gatherers, and 90% of our life on the planet, we were hunter-gatherers, and in the last few minutes we've been farmers, and the farmers are the dominant society, and they've kind of erased the hunter-gatherer. So in England, generally speaking, it's the ruin, the lawn, the English estate park, green grass with planted trees randomly, supposed to look like wild, but is planted. So when you come out of that world, which I'm part of, then you can find out about Arne Næss in Norway. And I had the great privilege of meeting Arne Næss. I think he was 93 at the time, and a student of his who was in his 70s. It's very funny that, and the man, he's called Stein, which is stone. I thought that's a good name. So he drove me to the house of Arne Næss and knock on the door, and the door opens, and I went to shake the hand of Arne Næss, and then he immediately got me into arm wrestle like this, and he said, "What are you laughing and smiling at?" And I said, "Why?" He said, "Oh, so then he started what he calls Gandhian boxing. So it's not actually, you don't actually get hit, you just kind of like messing about, like
non-violent
boxing."
No, I had the same assistant, drove me also to him. And kind of Arne Ness was making fun at the idea that his assistant was already in his his student was in his 70s. And that's a little bit like when I went to see Gadamer, the philosopher, he was 100 years old. And he had a laughing attack that his student Habermas just had turned 75. He thought it was hilarious. And then he fell asleep. It was really scary, and then I didn't know what to do, right? Because it's kind of scary when your interview partner falls asleep, and then it's a 100-year-old philosopher, and then I was like thinking, OMG, what should I do? And then luckily the telephone rang, and then he woke up, and then he answered, and he said, Gadamer, I'm in an interview, I've got to call you back. And then he looked at me, and then he looked at the camera, and then he said, you will have a great difficulty to transcribe my silence. Which of course leads us to the book of our friend Erling, who wrote the book on silence. Last question I wanted to ask you before opening it to the floor. Rainer Maria Rilke wrote a beautiful little book, which is an advice to a young poet. And I wanted to ask you in 2018, what would be your advice to a young artist/walker?
Concentrate on the walking and the art will take care of itself.
Thank you all for being here. Thanks Artissima, and thanks Hamish. Thank you so much.
Thank you.